Opening in 1836, the Ffestiniog line is one of the oldest operating narrow-gauge railways in the world. It is a wonderful attraction and a must-see for anyone visiting Wales. A vintage railway also comes with vintage engines, and the oldest operational engine that calls this railway home is Prince. The main product of this narrow gauge railway was the movement of slate from the slate mines around Ffestiniog to the port of Porthmadog, where they could be transported around the world. The construction of the line was overseen by James Spooner, who used the mountain's terrain to create a near enough perfect downward gradient from the mines to the sea. The original trucks were powered by horsepower, but when the slate was loaded, the horses were loaded into a special wagon and the whole train could be free-rolled to the port with a brakeman for control. Once unloaded, the horse would then begin to process again by pulling the empty carts back up to the mines. But the demand was outstripping supply and the horses were not able to keep up. But the idea of using miniature engines had not been done yet, and there was no room for a standard gauge railway. Many thought the idea impractical, but Spooner was undeterred. He knew that the future lay in steam power and knew there must be a way to make an engine run on the narrow gauge line. George England and Company offered to take up the challenge. In 1863, the company delivered two narrow gauge engines called Princess and the Mountaineer, and were proved to be very successful. The Prince arrived shortly afterwards. Although it was the third arrived, there is some confusion whether it was it or Mountaineer that was the second built. It didn't help either. It was, and still is, labelled number 2. It was named after the then Prince of Wales called Albert, who then became Edward VII. The engine sported a 040 wheel arrangement with an open cab and side tanks. Although the engines were successful, the terrain was making the engines work hard, so much so that they had to be placed on a maintenance rotation every quarter, and that would be 2 weeks of intense repair. But even with this programme, the Prince had a hard time of it. In 1878, the Prince had an unfortunate mishap where it lost its chimney. Mountaineer came to the rescue and supplied its own, and in 1881, the Prince's boiler was deemed troublesome, and while the boiler was deemed safe to use, the pressure was restricted. Being a mountain route, this was going to be a real problem, so to increase adhesion, the engine was fitted with extra tanks on top of the side tanks, and other improvements included new weatherboards, cylinders and retubing. The improvements made the engine last a few more years, but the boiler was deemed irreparable and unfit, so the engine was withdrawn in 1891. But the Ffestiniog was not ready to call time on the old engine yet. Much to the relief of the crew, the engine was fitted with a fully enclosed cab and the tanks were removed in place of a saddle tank. It was also given the name of just Prince. But Prince's luck was just not with it, and in 1894 it wound up in the works yet again, this time with a broken axle. Luckily, the double Fairley engine Little Wonder was able to supply one of its own axles, but the boiler was still giving trouble. The engine underwent 2 more boiler retubings and a new smokebox in 1912, but by 1915 the engine was once again deemed unfit for work, needed a new boiler and overhaul. In 1920 the engine got the boiler it needed and was celebrated by taking the first train on the new line from Dinas to Porthmadog under the new Welsh Highland Railway. During this time, focus had shifted from moving slate to moving passengers and ran successfully for the next 10 years with little fuss. In 1932, the engine was overhauled and parts repaired, but the overhaul was not a fully extensive one and the boiler remained untouched. By 1935, the boiler was again causing a concern, and deciding that another new boiler was required, the engine was withdrawn. But the Welsh Highland Railway hoped to be a real economy game changer, saw disappointing results, and the railway lasted less than 20 years. By 1937, the Highland Railway had shut down, which hit the Ffestiniog hard. It was hoped that the steaming fees and the engine loaning fees would help Prince get through the rest of the cost of the overhaul. It didn't help when the engine was inspected. The boiler was not the only issue. The firebox was beyond any form of repair and would need to be replaced, adding to the spiralling costs. But the railway persevered. This was one of the oldest and hardest working engines on the railway, and any repairs would be worth it. A new boiler and firebox was ordered and the chassis amended to accommodate for it. But the money was getting tighter and tighter. Coupled with the hardship of the war, the railway sadly succumbed to the pressure and closed in 1946, with Prince's new steel boiler having just arrived and just fitted. But the popular line wouldn't stay closed for long. There were several groups that collated together to plan on buying it. Alan Pegler was approached to help, and he agreed with the help of his father. He cleared the old railway company's debt and he bought the line in 1954. But the owners must have got a huge surprise when the main shed doors were opened and the little engine was sat in its mid-rebuilt state. Apart from nearly 10 years of dust, it was as though someone had just closed the doors the night before. The tools were left out and the boiler sat on the engine just waiting to be run. It was clear that Prince was the perfect candidate for the first engine to be restored on the line. It was also a huge bonus that foreman fitter Maurice Jones was a part of the group and was one of the very last engineers to work on Prince in the 40s. After the completion of the line, Alan gave up the ownership of the railway without penalty to the Ffestiniog Trust, which have run the railway ever since. Under the care of the Trust, Prince ran well for the next 7 years, where another overhaul was planned. But this overhaul would be very different to the previous ones. It was discovered that the majority of the rate through the drawbar load was taken through the boiler. Given Prince's past issues with the boiler, this could have been the cause, so modifications were implemented so that the drawbar weight was taken through the frames instead. It worked and allowed him to work for his 100th birthday, and in 1968 the engine was given yet another makeover. This time the coal was replaced for oil firing. The boiler was superheated and the frames altered again to carry the saddle tank and the cab. Interestingly, during this overhaul, it was found that many parts of the tank may have been taken from other engines. The rebuild also uncovered a brand new livery that was used in 1920s. Prince sported it proudly, and by 1988 it was able to celebrate its 125th birthday. Prince had his next overhaul in 1997 and worked not only on the Ffestiniog but on other railways as well. In 2004 it travelled north to York for the Railfest exhibition and was the engine of honour of opening the Welsh Highland Railway to Rhydyw in 2003, where Prince Albert's great-great-great-grandson Charles III, then Prince Charles, drove the engine. Prince is one of the mainstays of the railway and one of its shining stars. He is not the oldest narrow gauge engine, but he is the oldest in service. Currently he's undertaking an overhaul. It was found that the saddle tank was in need of repair and had rusted through, and there were several spots that needed attention. It was hoped that the overhaul would not be long, and money has already been earmarked for a new boiler after the ticket expired in 2022. Now, the story of Prince's discovery may have struck a similar chord to younger railway enthusiasts, especially those that have read the Railway series. Basically put, Prince is Duke. Unfortunately, the story of the discovery of a little old engine in the shed was at one point rather common. Either railways have gone bust like the Ffestiniog did, and engines were put in storage, or forgotten projects from loved ones long since passed. The story of Prince was begging to be immortalised in the books, which Audrey was only too happy to oblige, and while we have the story, we have a rare opportunity to enjoy its real-life basis as the living, breathing engine that shows it can survive anything thrown at it.